in addition to the devastating effect of the COVID-19 crisis on health and mortality, there are major consequences for the labour market. But the information on this impact is actually rather fragmented and often anecdotal. And in this situation, ISLE members are a rather important pool of expertise on the labour market issues concerned. Many of them have personal experience on the impact of the crisis or have local sources of information. So a survey of ISLE members was carried out in the last week of May to ask their assessments of the impact of the crisis and their views on the policies needed to overcome it. And there were 520 valid responses. The first series of questions concerned the groups who have been most affected by the crisis in terms of employment and income in the state of residence of the respondents. And the graph gives the percentage of respondents choosing each category. So starting at the top with the distribution by age, the great majority of respondents thought that middle-age groups between 30 and 59 had been most affected. Less than 20% thought that the younger people under 30 had been most affected, and less than 10% identified older people. That refers to employment and income, of course, because obviously older people are more vulnerable to the disease itself. In terms of the sex distribution, a large majority thought that men had been more affected than women. 76% men, 26% thought women more affected. But there's a nuance here, because among women respondents to the questionnaire, 59% thought that men were more affected, whereas among men, 89% thought that men were affected. So there's a very large gender difference in the perception of the impact of the crisis. In terms of caste groups, the majority thought middle castes were most affected. Dalits were second, some way behind. Large majorities thought that the urban population was more affected than the rural, and migrants more than residents. In terms of labour market categories most affected by the crisis, the majority view was that the unskilled were more affected than the skilled, that wage workers were more affected than the self-employed, a large difference there, that contract and casual workers were more affected than permanent workers, that the unorganised sector was more affected than the organised sector. And in terms of branches of activity, those working in industry and construction, trade and services, much more affected than those in agriculture. The next question, which I didn't put up on a graph, was how long do people think the disruption to employment and income will last? And more than half of the respondents thought that it would last for more than 1 year. In terms of the impacts, respondents were asked to choose the 3 most important impacts of the crisis in their state of residence, apart from the effect on health and mortality. Loss of employment was by far the most important, chosen by more than 90% of respondents. Loss of production identified by almost 40%, closure of businesses by 30%, 40% focusing on hunger and food shortage here. Let me use my cursor to point these out. On the other hand, family impacts, including violence against women and children, increase in child labour, impact on the family, were given less importance. And that was true of both male and female respondents to the questionnaire. Next, respondents were asked to choose 3 from a list of short-term policy priorities. They were given this list of options on the left. Protection of workers and families came top. And that included things like masks and social distancing and disinfection of work sites. Not far behind came short-term employment creation and income transfers for affected workers down here. Those were the 3 with the largest number of selections. And then there's a series of other measures. which included on the production side increased support for agriculture, loans and subsidies for small businesses, and on the welfare side, reinforcement of food distribution and housing and care policies for migrant workers. So a pretty wide range of policies identified by the respondents. And in addition to this list, the respondents were asked to write in a couple more options that they would think, additional priorities that they thought needed more attention. And there were many suggestions, which we've grouped in this graph. In fact, a majority of these suggestions were further development of the issues already mentioned in the original list. So priority was again given to small enterprises here, to expanding job creation through MG Narega, cash transfers and social security, and support for agriculture as well. Again, a rather wide range of policy options which were suggested. Well, one surprising thing was we looked at the pattern, the distribution of these priorities by region of residence, and we found that there were actually relatively small differences across regions of the country. The priorities appeared to be pretty much the same all across India. Next question was whether the balance between the centre and the state was right in terms of the implementation of these policies. And there was a clear response that only about 20% thought that the current balance was about right, and almost 70% thought that in the current crisis more responsibility and resources should be devolved to states. That was mainly about the short-term impact of the crisis. We then had a series of questions about the long-term impacts and the long-term policy issues. And this graph gives a list of, we gave a list of options and asked whether respondents felt that these were likely long-term consequences of the crisis. And what we see is there was a widespread expectation of lower economic growth after the crisis, more than 70% of respondents. But in addition, more than half of respondents expected that there would be a rise in inequality. And many expected a reorganization of employment in terms of teleworking, the gig economy, and also connected with that disruption of supply chains affecting the production process. More than a third of respondents anticipated a growth in public debt leading to austerity measures. Less than a third thought that there would be more public support for universal social security, and only a rather small minority thought that the crisis would lead to better organization of workers. And then respondents were asked what did they consider the most important policies, longer term policies for the future, with a fairly long list, and respondents were invited to choose up to 5. Top of the list, perhaps it's not surprising, was a stronger public health system, chosen by 3/4 of respondents. And 3 other policy areas were identified by more than half of respondents. More funds for MG Narega and an urban extension, policies for the welfare and rights of migrants, and the universalization of social security. Those were the top items on people's list. And in fact, in addition to the universalization of social security, there were 2 more specific social security measures in the list, universal basic income and unemployment insurance. And both of these areas received significant support. So that overall, if you take these 3 social security measures together, the priority was clearly for a much larger investment in social security and social protection, even if there were differing views on the nature the type of social security needed. But that has to be compared with the previous slide, which showed that only one-third of respondents thought that there would actually be increased public support for universal social security. On this list, there are several labour market measures which were identified by 20% or so of respondents: action against discrimination, better labour market information systems, investment in literacy and training, stronger regulation of employment relations. And if you take those together, they amount to a strong case for stronger and better labour market policies as an important part of the response to the crisis. There was less support, but some support nevertheless, for the idea of increased workplace democracy. And finally, greater investment in urban infrastructure, in housing, and in new technologies. Public sector investment received significant support. Now in those policies, there were some regional differences, and summing that up, the differences were not huge, but in the south of the country, there was greater emphasis on workplace democracy, better labour market information, more funds for Narega and the rights of migrants. And in the north of the country, there was relatively more emphasis on social security. But nevertheless, the pattern across the country, there were not huge differences in pattern of responses across the country. And then, as a final question, respondents were invited to add their own suggestions in terms of long-term policy needs. And there was a very wide range of suggestions. We've tried to group these here, but there's a lot of material which can be looked at in more detail later. So there are many ideas here. Employment, social security, public health, labour market institutions, and the situation of migrants, they all came up again. And there were additional ideas for industrial policy, including technology policy and support for small firms. That actually was the item that got the largest support of all. Skill development, quite a lot of emphasis on that too. Reduction in inequality, including reduction in gender inequality, rural development, and macroeconomic policy. But the interesting one here was that many respondents also identified, in this line we have grouped together responses in terms of the need for better governance and more decentralization, both to the states and to local communities. So that's the summary of the results of this quick survey. Many of these issues, of course, are on the agenda of the conference, and some of these issues may merit further investigation, perhaps a follow-up survey of ISLE members after the conference itself. And we'd like to thank the many ISLE members who took the time to answer the question and to give their views.